So we talked about the inspire stage, and in the inspire stage is all about setting the context of why we are getting into design thinking at the first place. So while you have to inspire yourself about solving that particular problem, you have to also inspire your entire team as to why they should be going after it. And a good starting point of that inspiration piece is called as a design brief. Now, design brief is a brief statement of intent as to why we are interested in going about this particular problem. Now, a good design brief has three conditions to it. The first condition is it has to be inspirational. Now, what I mean by inspirational, it has to create sort of a stretch goal. If it is a linear way of thinking, then it doesn't warrant any creativity. For example, I am sitting here and 3 feet away is the camera which is recording me. If I have to go from this place to that particular camera in a single hop, then I can possibly stretch myself and manage to take a single hop. But I have to go from this place to the end of the room, which is say 15 feet away from my place, then I can't do that with a single hop. I need to be creative, which means that creativity gets triggered only when you are given a stretch target. Minus a stretch target, people will be thinking linearly, people will be thinking in terms of productivity. Okay? So that is where it has to be a stretch target or some sort of an inspirational target. So the first condition, it has to be a stretch target. The second condition is it has to be constrained. Okay? So for example, if I give you two design brief, I can see it on your screen. Design brief A is how might we improve the employee retention from say 80% to 99%. Now that's certainly a stretch target. From 80% retention to 99% retention is an absolutely stretch target. So that's statement A. Statement B is how might we improve the employee retention from 80% to 99% without increasing the cost of operations by more than 5%. Now, which of the two design briefs makes more sense to you? One without a constraint or the one with a constraint? I bet it is the one with the constraint, because what constraints do to you is that the constraints are the ones which really push you to be creative. Minus constraint, there is no creativity. Only when there is a constraint, there is a creativity. For example, when we have to put the Apollo 11 mission on the surface of moon, the constraint that they had was that the capsule or the lunar module, as they call it, LM, the lunar module had to have enough fuel that it can land safely on the moon and also come out of the lunar gravitational pull, which is 1/6 of the Earth's gravitational pull, and do a rendezvous with the main orbital which was orbiting lunar surface. Now, the constraint was it has to have enough fuel, but it has to be light enough. Now, if you put more fuel, then it becomes heavy, but if you do not have enough fuel, then it becomes too light and then maybe it can't have a automatic lift off. You see, so that is where the constraints are. So when you have a constraint, there is a creativity, but by making it too constrained, you again strip it off creativity, which brings to the third important attribute of a good design brief, which is called as vagueness. It has to be vague enough. So again, if I go back to my statements, statement A, how do I improve the employee retention from 80% to 99%? Statement B, how do we improve the employee retention from 80% to 99% without improving or without increasing the cost of operations by more than 5%, which is a good constraint. And statement C is how do I improve the retention from 80 to 99 without increasing the cost of operations by 5% by looking at compensation. Now, A, B or C. In A, I do not have a constraint. In B, I have a constraint. In C, I have a constraint plus a directionality in terms of looking at employee attrition. A, B, C. Which of the three statements do you think we will have better ideas? I guess it is the B. The statement C has a problem with it, and the problem with statement C is that it is too directed towards compensation, which means it is not vague enough. By keeping it vague, you are allowing people to have multiple possibilities. So a good design brief is at 10,000 feet. It's not at 30,000 feet where it is too vague. It is not at 20 feet where it is too detailed. It is at 10,000 feet, which is a very good mix of being constrained and being vague. A very good example or metaphor for you to think about design brief is a sandbox. Now, all of you have seen a sandbox where children play. The beauty of the sandbox is that the sandbox is a very clear cut boundary out of which children are not supposed to go, or there is no sand out. But inside that sandbox or the sand pit, the sand is malleable. You can create any form, any shape of the sand, you can play with the sand, you can do your playfulness within the box, but outside the box there is no playfulness, which means a design brief makes a very clear cut boundary as to what are the conditions under which you must be operating, and inside it you can be as playful as you deem suitable. So, which is a very critical aspect of a leader. A leader, a manager or a program manager, which is you in this case, have to spend a lot of time in coming out with a very clever and a very well drafted design brief. And oftentimes what happens is that people gloss over it. People don't pay too much attention as to what a good problem definition is. And if a problem is not well defined, it can never be solved, because different people will have different assumption about what the problem is. So, good thing is to always spend a lot of time, bring people together on a particular problem, brainstorm about the definition of the problem, make it tight but not too tight, make it aspirational but also within reach. And a very beautiful example of a good design brief is the very famous statement that Kennedy made, which is we need to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely by the end of this decade. Now, the beauty of the statement was that putting a man on the moon is inspirational by itself, because after Yuri Gagarin, who was the first man to go into space from Russia, we have never had a manned mission to moon. As a matter of fact, as I am talking to you right now in 2025, we haven't had a manned mission after 1972. The last time a man or a human went to space was 1972. After 1972, we haven't had a single human being landing on the surface of moon after 1972, which I think is an amazing instance that how costly, how prohibitively costly and risky it is to put a man on the moon. And yet in 1969, we had Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking there. So, to put a man on the moon is inspirational by itself, because in 1962, NASA was clueless as to how this is going to get achieved. It was constrained because he said that bring him back safely by the end of the decade, which means a very clear cut constraint was given. Kennedy did not say that we need to put a man on the moon, bring him back safely, and timeline is by the end of the decade of 1960s. But it was vague enough. He didn't say how. He didn't say that it will be government, it will be a private player, it will be agency which will work across multiple governments, we will collaborate with some of the other space agencies. No, he didn't say any of that. He just put the statement, and that galvanized millions over millions of people, not just in the US but world over, to put a man on the moon. Similarly, we have back home in our organizations, in our own countries, where these very powerful statements are being made. For instance, many years back, I was at Madurai, and Madurai is famous for many reasons. Of course, one of them is the Meenakshi temple, the world famous Meenakshi temple in Madurai. But another very amazing thing about Madurai is the Arvind Eye Hospital. And Arvind Eye Hospital is one of the largest cataract facilities in the world and one of the most successful at it. There are many case studies written about it, and I would really encourage you to watch this particular video, which is there on the footnote, as to how this Arvind Eye Hospital manages to have so many cataract surgeries performed every day at next to nothing in terms of cost. And as I was walking and taking a tour of the hospital, I saw the vision statement of this hospital, which was clearly displayed at various places of the hospital. And mind it, how many times do we pay attention to a hospital's vision statement, isn't it? And let alone the vision statements being stuck to you. But that was a very, very cleverly crafted design brief. So, what was the vision statement? 3 words. The power of that vision statement was it had only 3 words. I have never ever seen a shorter vision statement than that. What are the 3 words? Eradicate needless blindness. That's it. And I thought that's a great design brief. Eradicate needless blindness. Why is it powerful? The first is inspirational, which is to eradicate, not reduce, eradicate. Constraint. Constraint is needless blindness, which means not all types of blindness, needless blindness. And I think the choice of word needless is very clever, because what we are trying to say is that something which is not really natural, which can be cured, and it is not getting cured because of lack of finances or because of lack of medical facilities or maybe lack of intent on the part of the patient, because many times people in our country or elsewhere also might be surrendering to the choice of God, saying that maybe I am destined to be blind, or maybe I am destined to be ill, but that is where the needlessness can be questioned, and I thought that's great. And another very good example which I would like to offer to you is that from Tata Motors. What we have over here is a brilliant statement which was crafted by Mr. Ratan Tata at the launch of the Indica. If you remember, Indica was the first indigenous car that any automaker in the country produced, and a very, very successful car at it, because Indica revolutionized the taxi business in India. So let me read this for you, and then you will realize that all the three attributes of it being aspirational stroke stretch, it having legitimate constraint, and it being reasonably vague is coming out. So let me read it for you. We need to design an Indian car from scratch. Ambassador, much as it is maligned, is the ideal size for the traveling Indian public. So we decided to design a car with the internal volume of an Ambassador, the size of a Maruti Zen, and the ease of entering and exiting, particularly for the rear seat. We thought of pricing it close to Maruti 800, which is a remarkably successful car, and adding the economy of diesel. Finally, we packaged this into a contemporary design. It's such a beautiful design brief. Now, what is the stretch here? The stretch is creating an Indian car from scratch. Never before we have had an Indian car developed from scratch. Marutis were all developed with the help of Suzuki. Then we had a constraint. What was the constraint? The constraint was we need to bring the best of Ambassador, the best of Maruti Zen, and the best of Maruti 800, but making it a diesel car, because all the cars that we are talking about were petrol car. So that is the economy of the diesel, because Tata Motors was always a diesel engine making company since they were into trucks, and putting it all together in a contemporary design, because when Tata Indica came out, the design was highly contemporary, especially the front part of the car was highly contemporary, and I think it was ahead of its time in terms of its internal space, and that's the reason why it became such a successful car when it came to taxis. So in summary, the starting point is to come up with a very, very powerful design brief which can really outlive that particular project. For example, Google's design brief was to make web as accessible as flipping through a magazine. Now, magazine is used as a metaphor here. Now, when I am flipping through a magazine, what are the attributes of that activity? One, it is intuitive. Second, it is very fast. Third, it is very easy to maneuver. I can go back and forth in the magazine. I can just flip through the pages of the magazine with my single thumb. Can I make net just like that? Possible. Similarly, when Mahindra was coming up with this remarkably successful XUV 500, what is the metaphor they used? The metaphor they used was cheetah. So they went to the wilderness of African jungles and they saw the cheetah in its natural habitat. And that's the reason some of the very design elements of XUV 500 are that of cheetah. The grills are the jaws of cheetah, the handle doors are the paws of cheetah, the whole monocoque body of XUV 500 is that of the stance of a cheetah, and that became a revolutionary product in our roads. So in Indian cases, we have a lot of examples where we've used design thinking unbeknown. Similarly, when Royal Enfield was to design the Himalayan, and Himalayan was a bike which was a complete grounds up development, an extremely successful bike that came from the stable of Royal Enfield, the Himalayan 411cc, where they re-looked at the design of a Royal Enfield which was made exclusively for the off-roading, and as a result we see that being a very, very successful bike. So examples galore, all we need to do is to keep an eye, but at any rate what I can offer to you is that don't rush through the definition stage. In my personal experience, one of the biggest reasons why design thinking programs fail is because people have not paid a lot of attention and have not given a lot of time in coming up with a very compelling design brief. If your design brief is powerful, well thought through, and it can outlive the duration of the project, I think you have done a fantastic homework. So all the best with that.